seats again and we'll get started. Well, good morning again and welcome to the church. We're here today finishing off the book of Mark, and Mark's been a great book. I've really enjoyed it. There's a lot in it, and I hope everyone's enjoyed the book of Mark. I've got the privilege of dealing with the last chapter, chapter 16, which is probably my favourite because in a sense it's a summation of the whole of the book. And it ties it together very nicely. So as I'm preaching on chapter 16 today, I'm kind of doing a bit of a summation and going back and looking at the whole as well for our context. I titled today's message, The Messenger. Now, anyone who's ever been at a workplace or an industrial workplace knows there's a pecking order, don't you? Yeah, apprentices don't tell tradespeople what to do, correct? And then tradies don't tell the engineers what to do, correct? And then the engineers don't tell the CEOs what to do. And there is a kind of a pecking order, and it kind of works well, and there's sort of reasons why you do that. I can remember as an apprentice, in fact, not even an apprentice, I'll tell a more recent story. I started at Omnia a while ago, and I came in as a production worker. And I saw one of the guys struggling with a piece of equipment. And so I came up with a bright idea. And I said, use this. This will help you out. And he grabbed it and he threw it. And he just basically wasn't going to take any advice or thoughts or anything from me. And basically dismissed it. And you think, well, what is going on there? I'll tell you what's going on there. It's the pecking order. The new guy doesn't tell the old guys what to do. Yet, strangely enough, I have stayed at this workplace and the pecking order has now changed. I am now telling him what to do, and he's coming to advice for me in a different role, of course. But it just goes to show that the hearts of men, come on, we all admit it, we're all filled with pride, and we don't like people who are under our station telling us what to do. We would agree with that? Now, I'm pretty sure it's the ladies are the same thing as well, because they don't like being told what to do by their husbands. True? Yeah, it's true, all right. You better believe it. But there are circumstances when that pecking order all falls apart. For instance, an apprentice or the lowliest of workers can walk into the CEO's office and yell out the words, "Fire, get out." And the CEO will forget all about the pecking order, the supervisor will forget about the pecking order, and everyone will obey what the apprentice instructions are. There's a fire, get out. And you see what I mean? There's something larger than the pecking order or people's stations in life. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what has this got to do with today's sermon? Well, it's got everything to do with today's sermon because a message went out from the boss. Jesus sent out a message to his believers and they refused to believe it. They simply refused to accept his message to them, which is kind of bizarre. And my message today is simply this, and my proposition to you all is that do we believe the good news? To which you're all going to sit here and nod your head and go, yeah, we do. Yeah, don't we? Yeah, we do. Well, but let's sort of tease this out a little bit. And before we can answer my proposition, we have to answer another question. And that question is, what were the apostles thinking when they were told that he was risen and they refused to believe it? Why did the apostles not believe? And this gets to the very heart of the book of Mark and my proposition today. And we know that they didn't believe it because hang on, I just got the scripture also I can refer to it. We know they didn't believe it because in verse 14, Jesus sits down with them And he reprimands them. He rebukes them. And not only does he rebuke them, he says that they got hard hearts. So that's a bit unfair, isn't it? It's just like, hang on, this is Jesus' followers. You know, they're accused of a lot of things. But Jesus is accusing them of having hard hearts. And how is that far? Because when we look at the story thus far in the book of Mark, it's a progression of people following Jesus, is it not? And how they drop off one by one. So we saw in the first half of Mark how the first people to drop off following Jesus, and you know, like being Jesus fans, were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And then slowly his family start to question him as well. And then we read about how we got to Mark 8, and we see this triumphant statement by Peter, who says that, yes, you are the Christ. And it's kind of like the pinnacle, the highlight for the apostles, because they're getting it right. But we know the story from Mark 8, 9, 10, 12, 13. The apostles are then started to be shown in a poor light. They're not getting quite things right. And in one particular verse, we read that they were starting to follow Jesus from a what? From a distance, because they were afraid of where Jesus was going. Many had fallen away and had stopped following. But at least the disciples, at least they went the furthest, didn't they? They got to the garden. I mean, you know, there was no one else there, so you'd think they'd sort of get some recognition or some reward. But Jesus rebukes them and says that they had hard hearts. And we've got to ask ourselves, well, what is it that was in their hearts that warranted that rebuke, or what was it that was in them that Jesus would say that their hearts were hard in the first place? And the context of this whole story builds up and comes to this pinnacle because the apostles, where they dropped off was they weren't offended with the teaching, they weren't offended by the miracles, they weren't even offended by Jesus proclaiming to be God. Where the apostles fell away from is that they fled at the sight of Jesus' plight. And I'm a poet, and you didn't know it. But literally, Jesus' disciples, they fled when they saw the plight and the direction that Jesus was taking, because it was not a direction that they were willing to go. They had already shown that they were prepared to rebuke Jesus when he first told them that they were going to die. We see that they were now following Jesus from a distance. When he talked about his death and how I must go up to the road of Jerusalem. It all changed when they got into Jerusalem, because there was palm trees and fronds and hailing, and so it was all looking good. And if I may turn to the book of John as a bit of a digression, we can kind of see what was happening in the apostles' life, because in the book of John, John explains the dynamics of what was happening so powerfully. It says that they went and they were looking for Jesus, and it says very specifically that they had torches to find him. Why do you have a torch? Because you can't see, all right? And so it's dark and they can't see, and they need a traitor to highlight who Jesus was. So what does this all tell you? It tells you that the people that were coming for Jesus didn't know what he looked like. They needed someone to point him out, and they needed torches. Now, why am I saying all this? And the simple reason is simply this. Jesus could have slipped away. It was the middle of the dark. He could have slipped away easily. Has Jesus slipped away before? You better believe it. We see in the scriptures over and over again. They came to kill him. They came to throw him off a cliff. They came to arrest him. And each time he just, in broad daylight, he has the power to triumph over his enemies and slip away. Now, the apostles had seen that over and over again. But at this time in the book of John, they come to Jesus and they say, where is Jesus the Nazarene? And Jesus says, I am. I am he. And what happens? All the soldiers that were with them fell over onto the ground. And so this is a sort of a moment of triumph, isn't it? They come to get Jesus, and then his enemies are basically floored on the ground. And the picture you get painted is almost like Jesus has got the upper hand. Jesus has got their foot on their neck. And so Peter, emboldened by this, draws out his sword and cuts off the high priest's ear. And it's like, Peter's emboldened. There's action. There's victory. Jesus is about to triumph over his enemy. And then Jesus goes, put your sword away. It is my time. Put your sword away. Heals the servant's ear. And then they ask him again, are you he? And he says, yes. And so he doesn't slip away. He hands himself over to be arrested. And it was at this point that the apostles go, we don't get this. You're supposed to be defeating your enemies, but now your enemies have you in their grasp. It says that they bound him and tied him and carried him away. And it was at this point, what did the apostles do? Did they follow Jesus? Did they stand up for Jesus? No, what did they do? It says they fled. And in the book of Mark, it says that one even fled naked. You get the picture, don't you? That they were so keen to get away that they were prepared to lose their clothes, and one, who they believed to be John Mark, actually slipped away naked. Now, what has any of this got to do with all this? They were already disturbed by Jesus' foretelling of his death. You get it? They were already disturbed that it was possibly going to go this way. And when they saw that it was going the way, that he was going to be handed over and died, and then lastly, the crucifixion itself. Here is Jesus on the cross, and it all seems hopeless, doesn't it? In fact, Jesus has been taunted by his enemies. In Luke, 3 times he's challenged. If you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Challenged by the Pharisees, challenged by the soldiers, and challenged by the thief. The thief, the guy who has got no station at all, challenging God Almighty, if you are really the Christ, come down. And does Jesus come down? No. And if you were an observer of all this, you would see that it's a summation of all Jesus' ministry, that his triumph end has come to naught. He has been defeated by his enemies, the Romans. And all this is the contextual evidence is important. It's important to sift it through, I should say, as to what it is that they could not believe and why their hearts were hard. For in the past, the apostles were quite good. Jesus said, follow me, and what did they do? It says immediately they left their nets and followed him. So good for them. When they saw the miracles, they believed. Gee, Peter even walked on water. They were happy to follow Jesus, and they were happy to be a part of him all the way through. They even declared that he is the Christ, the Son of God. They saw the miracles, they believed, they proclaimed him as Christ, and they even vouched that they would all die for him. Yet at the sight of his demise, at the death on the cross, it says that they all went home and had given up. And the 2 that were on the road to Emmaus, which we see in chapter 16 here, says, we thought he was the Christ. But he's been dead for 3 days now, and it's all over. And so in the apostles' mind, and the 2 that were on the road to Emmaus, they thought that he was going to be the Saviour of Israel, but he's been crucified, it's all dead, and it's all finished. They fled, and they no longer believed. So this was not a question of the size or the largeness of the miracle that they had been told that had happened, because they were told that Jesus has been risen. Had they not? This is what this story is all about. The disciples get told, the apostles get told he is risen. And we often make the mistake and think it's all about the miracle. It's all about God ability to come back from the dead. And that's not all that an amazing thing, because Jesus had healed who? Lazarus, raised him from the dead. Jesus had healed Jairus' daughter, raised her from the dead. So they had seen people being raised from the dead. So what was the big deal now about Jesus being raised from the dead? Because this is about the hardness of the heart. This is where the crux of the unbelief is shown. And this unbelief is highlighted by the very manner in which the instructions are given by Jesus, and it shows the very expectation, the very core of what God expects. Now, what do I mean by this? We turn to the text now and we read the scriptures very carefully. And we have a story of the women going to the graveyard. And why were they going there? And the story is very simple. They were going there to anoint the body, weren't they? So what was their expectations? To see a risen Christ? No. They were going there to anoint a dead body because of the Saturday. Did they believe that Jesus had risen from the dead? No. Did the women have extraordinary faith that the men didn't have? No. They were in the same boat. But now listen to what happens here. It says they were looking up and they noticed that the stone had been rolled away, because they were asking who's going to remove the stone. And they entered the tomb. They saw a young man sitting there wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. But he said to them, "Do not be amazed." Now, what is an angel? An angel is a messenger from God, is he not? And so here we have a message. We have a message from God. And listen very carefully to what the angel says. He says, "Do not be amazed. You were looking for Jesus the Nazarene." A real person, an historical figure. They were looking for someone who was real. And it points to it's hard to explain this, but what they're trying to say here in the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus was a real person. He's not just some spiritual guru. He's not some sort of invisible person. He was a real historical, contextual person, a Nazarene. And then the angel goes on and says, "Who has been crucified." The messenger says, yes, Jesus, who was crucified. The summation of his whole life. The summation of the guy who commanded the winds and the waves to be seen. The man who commanded the demons to be quiet. The man who ordered the dead to be risen. The summation of his whole ministry is, he was crucified. And we're all sitting here and we Christianize the word crucified. But what we got to understand is, to be crucified meant that you were a criminal. It was the lowest way that a person could die. And the angel is pronouncing that, yes, he was crucified, but then in the next breath, he says this: he is risen. And he says these incredible words to the women. He looks at them and says, "See here, he is risen. See, here's where they laid him. See with your eyes. And what do you see, ladies? There's nobody there." Now we've got to ask yourself the question: why did the angel not rebuke the women? Did they believe? Does he rebuke them? Does he say they got a hard heart? No, he just points out the fact and he says, "See here with your eyes, he is no longer dead." Now, pause that thought, because this is incredibly important as to why then Jesus is going to rebuke the apostles. There's nothing wrong with not believing, because none of them believed. But now we have an angel declaring that he is risen. The next part of understanding the rebuke is the instructions. A messenger from God, the angel, says, go tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he has told you. Has Jesus told the apostles that he's going to meet them in Galilee? Yes. In Mark chapter 14, when he explains that he's going to be dead, he says, I will go ahead of you and you will see me at Galilee. Is that not instructions from the boss? Go ahead, I'm going to be at Galilee. Were they at Galilee? No, they're disobeying the boss. And now the angel comes, gives the instructions, and tells the women to go tell the apostles, go to Galilee, where you will meet him. It's the same instructions that Jesus has given. He's repeating the instructions. And then we have the message now comes via the women. And this is where anyone who knows anything about the old civilization and the Roman Empire would understand this. They see it. You don't have to explain the obvious. But to us modern day people who are a bit thick, we need to explain it. Because in the olden times, was a woman's word worth anything? And I don't mean to offend anybody. I'm just saying this was what the culture was. A woman's word could not be trusted. A woman was the lowest of stations. It's just like, I'm sorry, if a woman says something, you know, I don't believe it, it means nothing. Even in a court of law, a woman's testimony meant very little. So what is going on here? I'll tell you what is going on. Because in the book of Mark carefully denotes, and we talked about this in our study, that we start to see the apostles, they've got a bit of an attitude problem. And do you remember what their attitude problem was? When they saw others casting out demons? Do you remember what do you remember what the apostles said? They went to Jesus and said, we must stop these people. They're casting out demons. They're not part of us. Do you see what the apostles are doing? They're highlighting the station that they are in. They're highlighting where they are in the pecking order of things and who should be doing what and who shouldn't be doing what. It gets worse because in those same chapters we talk about here's Jesus predicting his death. He's about to, he's pouring his heart out to him and says, I'm on the way to Jerusalem where I'll be handed over and punished and die. And what were the apostles arguing about along the road? Who's the greatest? Here's Jesus saying, I'm about to do the most sacred servanthood act that you could ever imagine. And what were the apostles doing? They were arguing about who is the greatest. Remember when Jesus was at the Transfiguration and Peter, James and John were there, and what did they want to do? They wanted to set up tabernacles because they had seen this glorious thing. And God has got to say to them from heaven, shut up, be quiet. This is my son, listen to him. And the very next thing that Jesus tells the three is don't tell anybody this. And then he says, and by the way, I'm on the road to suffering. Because they're asking questions about the importance of Moses and Elijah. And Jesus is going, yeah, they're important, but the Son of Man must be handed over to die. You see, Jesus is repeating this same story over and over again, and all the apostles are worried about is their station, how they see things, who's the greatest. When they bring children to be blessed, the apostles are there saying, no, not children, because you mustn't disturb the master. When blind Bartimaeus calls out at the top of his voice. It's the apostles who are saying, "You quiet, quiet. Who are you, blind Bartimaeus? Don't be calling out your name." And yet it's blind Bartimaeus whose eyes are opened, and it says that he followed him on the road. This is great theology by Mark. That's basically saying that even the blind can see where Jesus is going. And yet the apostles do not see it, nor do they understand it. And the irony of all this is that while Jesus is predicting his death, the greatest is the servant, and that Jesus' death was the greatest act of servitude, the greatest act of submission, the greatest act of obedience that a man has ever seen. And the apostles saw it as what? Defeat. The apostles didn't see it. They saw it as a defeat, and they fled and they ran away, and they thought he was the disciple. They saw it as loss. They saw it as the end of the story. They had just witnessed the most obedient, self-sacrificing act of servitude where Jesus cried out and said, "Lord, if you can take this cup away from me, but not my will, but your will be done." They had just witnessed that, and the summation of all of this was what? That we thought that Jesus was the Messiah. Why? Because what Jesus did was not up to their expectations. Why? Because their hearts were filled with a pecking order. And in their pecking order, it just doesn't make any sense that the King of Kings would die. And the irony in all of this is that the women who are coming to anoint the dead body, what is it that they're doing? Is it not an act of servitude? Is it not an act that the lowest of the servants were doing? And the irony, surely you can all see it. It's the women who are still serving Christ are given the role of to go now tell the bigwig apostles that they got it wrong, and he in fact is risen. And of course when the women come, the response from the apostles is what? It's not that they don't believe it. It says they refuse to obey. And when you read all the Gospels and how it worked out that even Peter and John ran back, and it was Mary Magdalene, the prostitute to whom Jesus appeared to first. And when she goes and reports to them, they refuse to believe. And when the women go and report in Luke, it says the apostles said they were talking what? Nonsense. Nonsense. Women, what would you know? Like, it's nonsense. We saw him die. They refused to believe it. And in Luke, they called it nonsense. And likewise, when Mark uses the story of the two that went on the road to Emmaus, it's the same story. Because the two that went on the road to Emmaus, Jesus used the same words. He says, "Why are you guys so slow of heart to understand? What is it? Why don't you get it?" And so the application is brought home to us with the very rebuke that they did not believe those who told them the message. Read carefully what it says here in Mark. He says, he reprimanded them for their unbelief and hardness of heart because they had not believed what? Those who had seen him. It's not that they didn't believe the resurrection. They didn't believe the report from the women. They didn't believe the report from the two from the road to Emmaus. This is what Jesus is rebuking them for. And he says, it's highlighted by the hardness of the heart. They missed the meaning behind it all. Like the two on the road to Emmaus, Jesus states the same thing, slowness of heart to understand. Like, you don't have to be a genius. If someone's telling you you're going to die and you rise again, and then they die, you would think the risen bit is just, it's going to come, isn't it? But they missed the complete meaning. They did not understand the death in the first place. It's not the resurrection they stumbled upon. It is the death and the way and the manner that Jesus died. And this is why Mark uses these two messengers to drive home his point. The greatest is the servant of all. And they failed to understand this, that Jesus' death was him, in fact, being the greatest servant of all. The resurrection is in fact the validation and the vindication of his death. It is the proclamation of success that their hard hearts just couldn't understand. Because to accept the resurrection is to admit failure. To accept the resurrection, you'd have to admit, well, we got that wrong. We totally botched it there. And the failure of thinking that Jesus had failed, when in actual fact, he was accomplishing the greatest deed in the history of mankind, would have to be the greatest humiliation an apostle could face. That would be like me or an engineer designing something and then the TA coming to you and saying, oh, by the way, you got it wrong. It's like, off. What do you mean I got it wrong? And for the apostles to be sitting there and with Mary Magdalene coming and saying, he is risen. You guys got it wrong. You can understand the apostles why they refused to believe, because it's like, oh, trough. Yeah, how could we get this? How could we get this wrong? Their humiliation in this story is our focal point for what the whole gospel is about. The ending to this book is captured in verse 16. And it says this: the one who has believed and has been baptized will be saved, but the one who has not believed will be condemned. Why do I say that this one verse encapsulates the whole of the book of Mark? And the reason is because baptism and belief go hand in hand. And what do I mean by that? Baptism is a sign of what you believe. And I don't need to go into all the theology of baptism. It's laid out for us by the Apostle Paul in Romans. But basically, baptism is what? You go down into death and burial. And Jesus said over and over again, you want to follow me? You've got to take up your what? And what? Die. And so what is baptism? Baptism is a symbol that you are dying, that you are following Jesus into the waters of death. But if you could not accept the reason why Jesus had to die in the first place, then your beliefs are disjointed and they don't match up. And that's why Jesus put the two together, that baptism and belief go hand in hand, because the gospel, it's not about just the miracle of a resurrection. It's about the miracle that the King of Kings would give his life for you, that the King of Kings would die on a cross for you, that the King of Kings would go the most lowliest route and obey God and do something that no one else has ever done. And you know what Jesus did that no man has ever done? It is actually to obey God. Is actually to do his will all the way to the humiliation of the cross. The manner of his death was not a defeat. It wasn't even a humiliation. It was the greatest act of obedience and servanthood. And the resurrection by God is vindication and declaration almost of his pride, of his joy, of his at last someone has done my will. And the resurrection was a vindication of everything that Jesus had done wrong. And of course, the resurrection is a highlighting of the very failure and mistake that the apostles had made, in that they fled Jesus at that point of his death. He is risen is the good news, and is also the expectation of God that you believe not just in a miracle, but in the meaning behind the miracle, behind the story, behind the facts. And you know what? This is the whole point of the book of Mark, is it doesn't matter who tells you about this story. It doesn't matter where the story comes from. It doesn't matter who the messenger is, whether it be angels or whether it be a prostitute. The fact of the matter is that Jesus is risen, and God expects you to believe it. In a nutshell, the gospel is not about you. It's about God's Son. And it's about God being so happy with his Son that he rises him from the dead, because his work has been complete and has been approved and has given the big thumbs up. And if the gospel to you, if your eye is on the messenger and how it's delivered to you, then line up with the apostles and get ready to receive your rebuke. Because it's not about you. And the most beautiful thing about this whole story is that it's outside of us. Do you understand that? It's something bigger than us. It's outside of us. It's got nothing to do with our status or our station. It's very much like the apprentice who can run into the workshop and yell out the words, "Fire, fire, get out." And everyone knows what that means. This is not a time to be worrying about who's yelling out fire, because this is bigger than us. And so if God, of course, he picks women to go tell the apostles that he's risen. And that for us, the message behind it all is, will you believe? Will you just simply believe it? Not about the circumstances of how you believed. Like, do you have to go fishing and do you have to pray for God to give you a salmon on the beach before you believe? And the answer is no. Do I have to see a sign from God? Do I have to have an angel appear before me? Do I need some special circumstances to come to me to tell me the gospel? And what Mark is saying is no. Blessed be God if these things do work out in your favor. But at the end of the day, the expectation that God has is that it doesn't matter who tells you. It doesn't matter where the message comes from. If you hear that Jesus Christ has been risen from the dead, then rejoice and believe, because that's what God wants you to believe in. And at the end of the day, his instruction is for us is to go out and preach this gospel to the whole world. And so it doesn't matter who we are, it doesn't matter what station you are, God expects people to believe the message simply because not of the messenger, not of the quality of the messenger, not what the messenger looks like, not what the messenger smells like, not what the messenger's, whether he's black, whether he's white, whether he's employed or unemployed, it means nothing. Because the message is about the success that God has declared over the death of Jesus Christ. Everyone thinks it's a sort of the end game. Everyone thinks it's a terrible thing, and God is just going, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." And for us, the question is simply this: do we believe it? And that's something that we can all ponder and go home and ask ourselves, well, why don't we believe it? And sometimes the reason why we don't believe it is because we're still waiting for a special messenger to come and show us because we are so special ourselves. And what Mark is saying is there's no room for that. The apostles got rebuked by Jesus for not believing. Let's not us, the church, end up getting rebuked for the exact same thing. Amen.